space to enter it. Finally, over 3,000 years after they were hidden, the mummies in the secret cache were recovered in 1881 by German museum curator Emil Brugsch. The whereabouts of Ramesses' remains were no longer a secret. But nothing was found in the hidden cache of mummies or in Ramesses' own tomb to shed light on the mystery of the great king's missing sons. How could these princes, whose existence had been so thoroughly documented, vanish from history? It would take over 100 years to find an answer. That answer suggests that Ramesses' sons may have been within walking distance of their father's tomb all along. Coming out of Ramses' tomb into the Valley of the Kings, you can see that he had company. There are 61 other tombs here. Just a short walk up there is the legendary tomb of Tutankhamun. Seti I, Ramses' father, is buried there. Meneptah, his son, just around the corner. But where are the tombs of the many other sons of Ramses? Well, just 30 yards away over there is tomb Kings Valley number 5. And KV5 may well hold the answer to that question. In 1825, the Egyptologist James Burton entered the tomb. He pronounced it unimportant. Later, this whole area was buried under tons of rubble. Tourist buses passed within feet. In 1987, American Egyptologist Kent Weeks uncovered this entrance to the tomb. When at last he entered, he made what many call the most important discovery in Egypt since Tutankhamun. For the first time in over 3,000 years, the world edged closer to at last solving the great mystery of Ramesses' lost sons. For 450 years, Egypt's pharaohs were buried in a desolate desert canyon as a safeguard against tomb robbers. It has come to be known as the Valley of the Kings. Here, 62 tombs were dug from the limestone. These subterranean palaces were embellished with sumptuously beautiful carvings and paintings. But by the 3rd century BC, the Valley of the Kings lay silent and forgotten. In the early 18th century, an English clergyman named Richard Pocock visited the valley and drew its first map. Other European Egyptologists followed, but their mapping of the tombs remained imprecise and inaccurately plotted. In the 1970s, Dr. Kent Weeks, a leading American Egyptologist from Washington State, decided to begin the first mapping of the Valley of the Kings using survey techniques which relied on extremely accurate measurements. It would take over a decade of hard work just to accumulate all of the data. But sadly, by the late 1980s, there was little money left to print up the detailed map Weeks wanted. So he decided to use the knowledge he'd accumulated and tackle another ambitious task.
So I thought what we would do is to take the little money that we had at that point and do something that I had considered doing a few years earlier. And that was to go back into the historical records, try to identify tombs that had been seen in the 19th century but for one reason or another had gone missing, and try to relocate those tombs and put them on the map of the Valley of the Kings as well.
After an extensive search of historical records, one tomb stood out. It had been seen during the 19th century and given the designation KV5, standing for Kings Valley number 5. In 1825, the Englishman James Burton cut a 25-metre crawl space into KV5. He drew a sketch plan which revealed the presence of 11 chambers, but his notes did not inspire enthusiasm or excitement from his peers. Even Howard Carter, the discoverer of Tutankhamun's tomb, used the KV5 hillside only as a dumping ground for debris from his excavations.
They buried the tomb under 3 meters of fill. As if that weren't enough, another series of flash floods from torrential rains that hit the Valley of the Kings occasionally dumped more debris over the tomb entrance and hid it. By 1920, possibly even earlier than that, KV5 was a dim and distant memory. There was nothing to be seen.
But Kent Weeks was intrigued by the drawings of the tomb that Burton had made.
In his plan, it looked like no other tomb that I had ever seen before. Most of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings are long corridors cut deeply into the bedrock. This tomb, on the other hand, had, in Burton's drawing, about 6 chambers that went off in all directions from the entrance like tentacles of an octopus. And I thought, gosh, what a strange-looking tomb. Why don't we see if we can't locate this?
Something else grabbed Weeks' interest. By 1989, some researchers were suggesting that the lost KV5 might also be the missing tomb of Ramesses' children. From Burton's notes, Kent Weeks had an idea of where in the valley to begin looking. He made a decision. He would try and find what had been lost for so long.
We dug basically a narrow trench about 3 feet, a meter wide. The first thing we encountered was a cut in the bedrock that very clearly delimited a man-made, not a natural, pit or depression in the hillside. And then we began finding traces of staircases.
After months of hard work, Kent Weeks' staff had cleared the entrance pit to KV5. Now at last the moment had arrived to look inside.
Well, in the summer of 1989, we had cleared the stairway, come down to this doorway leading into the first chamber. Now, it didn't look like this. It was completely filled, floor to ceiling, with flood debris that had washed in.
What sort of level?
Right to here. Right to here. And it was only because of a small little channel that had been dug by James Burton in 1825 that we could see anything at all inside. Here are traces of Burton's lampblack on the ceilings where he was peering through.
So you just crawled through Burton's original tiny hole?
That's right. That was the only access into the tomb, and even at that point, we could not see any of the side walls.
Are we talking about inches here, or what sort of size was this?
Well, it was a tight fit for me, let's put it that way, a very tight fit.
So you managed to crawl in, probably a little guessing that you were going to be working just in this room for how long?
Watch your step. It took us 5 years to clean this chamber out. But even by the second year, we knew that we were onto something in KV5. Because at the top of the wall, we found a series of hieroglyphs that indicated that this tomb was the burial place of one of the sons of Ramses II, whose cartouche is here. And we have his name, Amenhotep. Now, that young man was the firstborn son of Ramses II.
So this was the first confirmation you had that one of Ramses' sons might be buried here?
Yes, exactly. And the firstborn son at that. But shortly thereafter, it got even better. Because on this wall, when we exposed the text at the top, we found another scene with Ramses, a god, and a son who here is not Amenhotep, but a son whom we call Ramses Jr. to avoid confusion with his father. Suddenly, we knew that we had a tomb with multiple burials. There were, at this point, at least 2 royal sons buried in this tomb. That was something that had never been seen before.
Kent Weeks was now certain that KV5 promised to be much more than just a minor tomb, even though he still didn't know if it was bigger than the 11 chambers detailed in Burton's original sketch. But making progress in unlocking KV5's secrets was agonizingly slow.
The Valley of the Kings may get, on average, 1 or 2 millimeters of rain a year, if that. But every once in a while, perhaps once every 50, 60, 70 years, a rainstorm hits this area and it causes disaster. By the time those waters, those floodwaters and their debris reach KV5, the entrance to the valley, they can be traveling at 30, 40 miles an hour, carrying boulders the size of stoves or refrigerators. The 11 floods that hit KV5 filled it chock-a-block full with debris, sand, silt, limestone chips, that over the centuries dried to an almost cement-like consistency.
Clearing away tons of flood debris which filled the tomb proved to be enormously time-consuming.
The techniques of moving dirt out of a tomb or any archaeological site in Egypt haven't changed much in the last 100 years. We still take baskets. These are made of old tires. fill them up using trowels or shovels or picks, whatever, and carry them by hand in a bucket brigade out the door of the tomb.
It had taken 5 years just to empty 2 small rooms. Although Kent Weeks had uncovered the names of 2 of Ramesses' sons, he'd found little else. Now the much larger Chamber 3 waited to be cleared. What Weeks would discover in this part of the tomb would justify all the years of patience and hard work.
Kent Weeks crawled into the 3rd chamber, into this tiny gap. He hoped to find something underneath this huge pile of debris. But he couldn't get to it. He realized that the weakness of these pillars and the ominous cracks in the limestone ceiling above my head meant that this whole area would have to be stabilized. Work that's only just been completed. Now, Burton's map shows a mysterious door against the back wall. And Kent Weeks gradually dug his way towards it until by 1995, he'd managed to find just enough space to crawl through that doorway. What happened next is one of the great moments of modern archaeology.
Kent Weeks at last prepared to look beyond Chamber 3. He would be heading into space no one had entered since the pharaohs.
We thought what we would find is another small chamber, like that in the front, Chamber 1, Chamber 2. Instead, we shone our flashlight down, and we saw nothing. Blackness. It meant that the chamber went on and on and on. We could not see an end wall. Later on, when we put electricity in the tomb, it turned into the most incredible sight I'd ever seen in my life. 100 feet down the corridor, lined on either side with doorways, we find a statue of the god Osiris.
So you came along here, and you must already have known that this was the most incredible find.
I kept saying to myself, my God, I can't believe it. There's nothing like this anywhere in the Valley of the Kings.
There are chambers here on every side. I mean,
every 10 feet or so, we find a doorway, some leading into small chambers, others leading into suites of rooms.
Most of them are blocked up, but you can see them quite clearly where they
Yeah,
are.
we haven't dug these yet.
It's incredible. You must have known at this moment that what you were finding here was probably one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the century.
Nothing like this has ever been found before.
So you got to this point here and you saw this amazing sight.
A life-size statue of what at first we thought was the god Osiris, but what we now think is a representation of King Ramses as Osiris, the deified king welcoming his sons down this corridor and into the next life.
The beautiful statue of Ramesses offered further proof that this was almost certainly a tomb for his royal sons. And with the amazing discovery of Corridor 7 and its complex of rooms, the significance of what Kent Weeks had revealed began to dawn on the world. Most of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings contain no more than 8 rooms. Ramses I, Ramses the Great's grandfather, had just 4, as did the legendary Tutankhamun. Weeks had already discovered at least 65 rooms, and more soon appeared. Nothing like it had ever been found. KV5 seemed to move off in all directions at once.
This corridor is very perplexing. It drops more steeply than any other corridor in the tomb. In fact, some of the side chambers that are cut here actually lie beneath the floor of chambers on an upper level. Now, at the bottom of this steeply sloping corridor, suddenly we descend 4 steps, and we find ourselves in another large pillared hall. In this case, one with 3 pillars down the center of the rectangular room. This is a good example, by the way, of the stratigraphy that we're confronted with in KV5. Filling this chamber, like the others, chock-a-block full of flood debris, you can see the different layers.
Deep inside the tomb, hundreds of feet from the entrance, flood debris continued to be a problem.
This is one of the many unexcavated corridors in KV5. This one heads south, directly towards Tutankhamun's tomb. Nobody's quite sure why. There's a blank wall at the end there, maybe another doorway. The problem is getting to it.
With all its chambers and corridors, this tomb is nearly half the size of a football